name is Mindy Romero, and I am the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the USC Price School of Public Policy. I'm also faculty there. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for the webinar and wish you good afternoon, of course. The title of today's webinar is California's Election Reforms: How do community organizing efforts navigate the state's election system to reach new voters? So the webinar is going to present new CID research on the perspectives of community organizing efforts, I should really say community organizations, right, that do work in some form in the elections or voter outreach space. Their perspectives on the challenges to conducting voter outreach in the state. We will also examine voter knowledge, levels of knowledge and awareness around voting options in California, factors in completing the vote by mail ballot, factors in the in-person voting process itself, and voters' preferences on how and when to vote in upcoming elections. The webinar, of course, is part of a larger CID webinar series looking at voter turnout and outreach. If you have not joined us for previous sessions, there's 5 of them every Tuesday, spanning part of May and June. Our last one is June 11th. They're from noon to 12:45, short and sweet, Pacific time. You can go to our website to learn more. I've actually put a link in the chat about the webinar series itself. And starting, I think next week, we should be able to start putting up the recordings. We always like to package them up with our partner at Price. And over the summer, it just takes a little bit longer. So those will start appearing on our website for those that you want to see a webinar you haven't seen before or share a webinar that you're interested in. We welcome you very much to do that. And then we also have released new research over the last couple of weeks. One report just last week on voter messaging in California. Actually, the title is Voter Messaging Challenges and Opportunities in an Equitable Election Landscape. The week before, we released a new report on California's ballot tracking service, and it's how people are using it, and also its impact potentially on confidence in voter behavior. And then this week, we will release a new report, which the title is in the chat already, and I'll talk about in a moment, and that's going to come out with the holiday a little bit later this week, but I'll be presenting new research from it. So those are all the housekeeping things. Again, links in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and jump in and share my screen. Okay, so as usual, I've got a lot to cover with you today in just 45 minutes. So we want you to, hopefully, if you're having lunch, enjoy your lunchtime, but we want these to be shareable, so that's why we keep them the 45 minutes. But it does mean that sometimes I'm talking a little fast and I'm covering a lot. We will make the PowerPoints, of course, available along with the reports. And sometimes there is a lot more detail in the PowerPoints that I'm not covering because I'm just running through highlights. And we could spend a lot of time on each of the slides and each of the charts and tables that I present. Know that you're able to do that at your leisure in as much depth as you want by reviewing the slides later, or of course, hopefully, if you have time and interest, examining the actual reports. All right. So I said this is part of a CID webinar series on voter turnout and outreach in California. Again, today's webinar, for those of you just joining us, I see a few extra people have joined, is California's Election Reforms: How do community organizing efforts navigate the state's election system to reach new voters? And I want to emphasize today, we're really focused on the state's election system. So if you're not aware, California over the last decade and a half has both passed and implemented a number of significant election reforms, from online voter registration to automatic voter registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, to over half the state's counties now adopting a new voting model called the Voters' Choice Act, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. Early voting, everyone who's registered receiving an automatically now a vote by mail ballot, a number of significant reforms. And how do community organizations, right, conducting outreach efforts navigate that? So, and as I mentioned, and as noted in the chat, I'm going to be presenting, actually my presentation is going to broken up into 2 parts. First, giving some background and some research on the perspectives of organizing efforts or community organizations, as well as election officials on outreach. And that's pulling on a number of different research projects. And then the second half is presenting the new research that I mentioned in the report that's coming out later this week. This report here, Voting Methods in California. So first, let's talk about the inequitable election landscape. I talked a little bit about this last week too. Why are we using that term? For those of you that weren't able to join us last week, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. If you didn't know, there are significant disparities in eligible turnout rates in our state and in our nation. They have been there, of course, historically by race, ethnicity, age, other voting statuses, or other groups' statuses as well. And they are still present and still significant today. And if you're interested in eligible voter turnout rate is simply the percent of those who are eligible to vote, essentially adult citizens, that actually turned out to cast a ballot. And turnout rates are much higher for older, higher income, those with higher educational attainment, and those that are white in California. And our overall electorate in any given election, whether it's high turnout or low turnout, those actually casting a ballot are not fully representative of the state's population or of the full eligible voter population. So we have an older, wealthier, higher income and more white, if you will, statistically electorate. At the same time as these turnout disparities persist, and those are really, we're talking about outcomes, right? At the same time, there's a significant difference in the type of information and outreach that voters get, also by race, ethnicity, age, and so forth. So adult voters in California experience an inequitable outreach and information landscape. We think of ourselves now as an information landscape, but voters, period, are information low. And even more difficult as of late, right? Trying to sift through misinformation and disinformation. But we know that the level of information that's coming, period, to voters or potential voters varies significantly by your demographic profile. And the way our electoral system is designed really in the United States, or functions in the United States and in California, is that the overwhelming majority of outreach effort, voter information, contact of voters, period, happens on the part or is done by election campaigns, candidates, issue campaigns, and so forth. And of course, all of those are not interested in getting everybody to vote. They're focused on getting those they think who are going to be likely to vote for them. And if it's in a non-competitive district, a safe seat, for instance, or a race that appears to be a landslide, very little outreach often will be done. So candidates are usually using their resources, right, to achieve the biggest bang for their buck. They use a likely voter model, and they are targeting those that through data, big data, we understand, right, have been modeled out to be the most likely groups to participate. And that means that whole swaths of our eligible voting electorate or population can receive very little outreach or sometimes none at all. And even when registered, if they're not part of that likely voter model, then they are less likely or very sometimes unlikely to receive outreach. So again, communities of color, young people in particular, right, will get much less outreach even when registered. And then we have the nonpartisan voter outreach efforts that are conducted by both election officials and community organizing efforts. And they remain greatly under-resourced for the scale of need. So we start with an inequitable landscape due to the way our system functions. And then election officials, of course, are largely charged with and want to ensure that they administer the election appropriately according to law and to reach voters with the information that they have. And then community organizations, voter advocacy groups, others in a nonpartisan fashion will reach out to groups to try to make up the difference, but they're really fighting an uphill battle. And of course, there's tremendously great work, nonpartisan work, trying to reach undersourced or under-outreached groups, but they are not resourced enough, right, for the scale of the need. Let's talk about implementation of election reforms, because that's our focus today. So I mentioned the long list of reforms. Well, I'm a public policy professor at USC at the Price School. And when I teach policy formulation, I'm always emphasizing to my students the importance of considering implementation in the policy formulation process, right? In the crafting of a law, a bill, for instance, in the conversation, in the debate, in the final form, good policy formulation, good policy period needs to include implementation wherever appropriate, right? It's not always right. Details are not always the most appropriate, but whenever appropriate, particularly so when we're talking about election policy. And unfortunately, in our general policy landscape, we don't see a lot of implementation considered or certainly not written into policy, or at least it's just not as frequent. And that is included generally in election reform as well. Many election reforms are only as effective as how people are aware of them as they are voter facing. So are people aware of that they can register online, for instance? Are people aware of the new voting choices in California, right? Thanks to the Voters' Choice Act or thanks to all counties being able to mail automatically a vote by mail ballot, things like that. Community groups and voter advocacy groups are part of implementation in nearly all types of election reforms, but they often are not considered in the policy formulation process, and often are not part of, or can often not be part of the official implementation process, right? But community groups are out there talking to voters about their voting options, about how to register, talking to young people about the possibility of registering when they're 16 or 17 years old, right? Talking about early voting, whatever it might be. And then, of course, direct collaboration. We know from our research and talking to election officials, community organizations, advocacy groups, and others, direct collaboration benefits all. But it varies significantly, right, in the degree, the size, the quality of that collaboration in implementation. So today's discussion, so that's a little bit of background. So the first part is I'm just going to run you through, again, some findings from multiple studies that we've conducted, voter organization surveys, election official surveys, voter file analysis, interviews with election officials and community stakeholders, talking about their perspectives around navigating election systems when they're doing outreach. And then the second part is the findings, highlights from the findings of that new report that I mentioned, Voter Methods in California. All right. So voter outreach efforts in election reform implementation. So from all of those different sources that I mentioned a moment ago, here are some findings. So importance of coalition building. So particularly from community organizations, we heard about the benefits of coalition building, sharing of resources, sharing of knowledge is almost always very welcomed. Doesn't always happen for a variety of resources, including resources, reasons, including resource or lack of resources. Needed awareness of reform specifics. So both on the part of the public, but also on the part of organizing efforts, right? Community organizations, advocacy groups have talked to us about not always, right, having all of the specifics that are tied to a given election reform and not being fully aware of all of those specifics. So in understanding that community groups, some work all the time in the elections field, some kind of come in and out, some come in just close to the election, some come in because of a specific issue or topic at a local level that's really important to them, whatever it might be. But a lot of organizations, right, in this space may or may not be fully aware of the specifics of the election reforms that are being implemented or just now available, right, to them as well. And also acknowledging that from the voters' perspective, the voters that they're working with needing information and education about election reforms, about their options, and often the organizations themselves, right, struggling to be able to give all of that. Again, a lot of great work that's done. This is just from some that we're hearing from as well. The target outreach materials are need to be a priority, right? And effective messaging. Media engagement is a key part of implementation and reaching voters. That should be targeted media engagement. And election officials and advocates both talk to us about being unsure of the demographic and geographic reach of their outreach efforts. So election officials legally have requirements in terms of how they outreach to voters and share information, of course, mailing things such as the voter guide, but also their engagement in larger outreach efforts like media or TV, advertising, whatever it might be, right? Bus signs, those kinds of things. Again, I'm not going to get into those details today, but I would say many election officials in California, probably the majority of them, definitely the majority of them, talked to us about all of the good work that they were doing, but ultimately not being absolutely sure, and often not being sure at all, about how far that work was reaching. Were they reaching specific demographics, particularly groups that were historically underrepresented and that they wanted to reach? A lot of that on the election official side was just not having the metrics to be able to measure that, or how the knowledge or the resources to be able to do that. And we also heard from many advocacy groups that also talked about the good work that they were doing, but not always sure that they were reaching everybody that they wanted to reach, and then also understanding that they weren't reaching often and couldn't because of resources, right? Everybody that they had planned or hoped to reach, or that was part of their mission. So a significant resource commitment required for community advocates. In particular, this point here is to say that when there are election reforms, right, community organizations are often funded to do general voter outreach and voter education, and then to get themselves trained and informed and to engage on the specifics of an election reform, right, to the level that they often will feel is needed, right, to be able to share that information with the public or those that they're outreaching to. It requires a significant commitment that often is unfunded, right, by funders, by grants, or other entities that are providing funding. And so they squeeze that that source as much as possible, their own time, but they are not funded often to do that level of work. Many don't have the resources to fully implement or engage with the reform that potentially impacts the success of the reform. Election officials and advocacy groups both talked about wanting to see a funding component, explicit funding component for voter outreach and education going forward. Some advocacy groups or community groups also talked about setting aside money to partner, to ask, right, or to require election officials to partner with community groups with that funding. And then both talked to some degree about, or have talked to some degree about, needing accountability as well around the resources, tracking and understanding if there's funding on, for instance, outreach. How do we measure the success of that? How do we measure the reach of that, right? To understand, learn from, and build on in the future. And then findings reveal significant overarching challenges that need to be tackled. So kind of moving back here away from just specifics of election reforms, we heard a lot from community groups that talked about just the broader challenges of voter outreach and education that are a huge factor when they are trying to talk about election reforms, right, or build election reforms in. So a lack of civic education and understanding about what and who is on California's sometimes daunting ballots, how that impacts the community, the fact that many community members, there's wide distrust of elections and political institutions, right? There's lots of polling data that back that up. Accessibility of information and voting materials in languages of origin, and inadequacies of traditional voter outreach messages or methods. Both election officials and voter or engagement organizations identified lack of funding, again, right, as a significant barrier. And voter orgs specifically expressed frustrations around EAPs, and those are the election administration plans that are required in Voters' Choice Act counties. Now we're at 29 counties out of 58 that are Voters' Choice Act counties. We heard frustrations about, for not all, but for many counties, at least to the level that voting orgs would like to see, a lack of specificity in terms of the actual strategies that were mentioned in those EAPs or included in those EAPs with regard to marginalized voters. And a majority of voter engagement orgs reported that they cannot do specific outreach reform because they are focused, right, on the basics, the importance of voting, why it matters to a community, who's on the ballot, how to cast a ballot, that sort of thing. And then the bottom line is the fact that we still have significant gaps, disparities in turnout in California across groups, says that we still have a lot of work to do, right? The numbers don't lie in that sense. Great work that is being done by election officials and community groups. Significant election reforms that have been implemented over the state, across the state, right, over the last 15 years. But we still see significant disparities. And of course, for many, not all, but many of the proponents of the election reforms, a big goal of those election reforms was to see not only increased turnout, but particularly a reduction in disparities, right? So we still have work to do in implementing and educating voters. And that, of course, doesn't talk about whether, I'm not talking right now about whether we should implement potentially other reforms. We're just talking about what's in existence now. Okay, so I mentioned the report, Voting Methods in California. I'm going to now transition over to that. The new report presents findings on the following factors in California voter turnout. I mentioned this at the outset. So voter knowledge and awareness about voting options, factors in completing the VBM ballot, factors in specifically the in-person voting process, voters' preferences on how and where to vote in the 2020 general election and beyond. And again, I put the link in the chat. For those of you that might have joined late, I'll put the link again at the end of my presentation, because I think when you join after, you won't see the full chat. But you can just also go to our website, cid.usc.edu. And by the end of the week, this report will be published on the website. And again, we have two reports that we recently released, one last week and one the week before, all or both touching on outreach as well, information that can inform outreach efforts. So I welcome you to, or invite you to look at those reports now. And this research, we want to note, is generously supported through funding from the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. We thank them again for making it possible. Okay, and then this study is drawing on our 2024 California Voter Experience Survey, which has informed a number of our new reports. If you haven't heard the rundown, just really quickly here already, we've talked about it in our other webinars. It's a very large survey. We've done this now a number of years in a row. It's this time the sample size is almost 12,000. It was conducted a few months ago, as you see, conducted in both English and Spanish. And in this report and the report last week as well, we present all of the data broken out by race, ethnicity, age groups, and for voters with disabilities. And in the online appendix, also broken out for Los Angeles County alone, as that is a fourth, of course, of the state's registered voter population. And we had a large enough sample size to be able to allow us to break it out for LA. Methods of voting in California. So just a tiny bit of background here, since I'll be talking about methods of voting. If you didn't know, again, everybody in California, if you're registered, you automatically get mailed a vote by mail ballot. That's been the case since 2020. You have options, though. You can put it through the mail. You can drop it off at a drop box. You can drop it off at a staffed voting location, vote center, or a polling place. Or you can just choose to vote in person, right, at a voting location. And in California, just focus on the left, you can see that not everybody does drop that ballot off in the mail. So out of all the ballots cast, 12.2% were at an in-person voting location. Another 40% was through the mail, a VBM ballot through the mail. 16.9% at a drop-off location, and almost 31% at a drop box. So you will note, and we note here, of course, acknowledge that in person now is much smaller than it used to be, right? Even a decade ago. But we do encourage people to do the math and add together in person and the votes that are dropped off at a staffed voting location, again, a polling place or vote center. That's about 29% in total. And we've learned in our research that there are significant reasons often why people are voting one method or another. We're going to talk about them today, some of them today. And so sometimes a staffed location really does matter to an individual voter when they're dropping off that ballot. And then some differences here by race, ethnicity. So Asian American, Black, Latino, all voters. You can see, I'll just for time, just have you focus on the in-person, the green segments of each bar, and you can see that in-person lower for Asian Americans, for Black voters about the same as the total population, but higher for Latinos, and significant variations by county as well. We want to note that, and that we cover in the report as well. So voter knowledge and awareness about voting options. So how did you hear about the options for how to cast your vote in your county in the November 22 general election. And we covered this last week. I just want to start because this is also, there's a little tiny bit overlap between the reports intentionally, and this data is also these data are also in the new report. You can see here that the people hear about it lots of different ways, but the most common way is a product of their county elections office, right? So 36% from the voter information guide, 23% from the county website, 37% from the vote by mail packet. And it just emphasizes the importance again of the voter materials, right, that election officials disseminate. But you can also see here that still almost 5% from voter advocacy groups, friends or family at 13.7%, social media 21%, media itself, newspaper, radio, TV, another 18%. And this people, of course, could answer multiple options, select all that apply here. And for time, I'm just going to show the data broken out by race, ethnicity, but there are significant differences on many of these questions by age, and differences also that are important to note for voters with disabilities. Those are in the report, but for time, I won't cover them, unfortunately. So by race, you can see here all eligible voters that we just focus on that county voter information guide, which was the number one, right, cited place that people heard about their options for casting their ballot. 36.8% for everyone, and Black voters less at 30%, Hispanic, Latino 25%, white voters 45%, AAPI 31%. So an example of the differences, right, in terms of information sources across racial and ethnic groups. Factors in completing the vote by mail ballot. Did you fill out your vote by mail ballot with anyone else, such as a family member or friend, or did you complete your ballot alone? 84% said alone, but another almost 16% said with someone else. And by the way, these are voters in California, right? And this is specific to the 2022 general election. And here we have it broken out by race, ethnicity. Again, big differences by age as well here, but I won't show you today. But just by race, ethnicity, remember for all eligible voters, it was 15.9%. Or all voters, and actually those that are actually eligible voters that actually cast a ballot. Black is a little bit higher, Latino a little bit higher at 19%, white a little bit lower, and AAPI a little bit higher. That's again with someone else. So a little bit higher for voters of color. With whom did you complete your ballot? So of those that voted and said that they completed their ballot with someone else, right, not themselves, but with someone else, we said, tell us who. 58% of that group said with their spouse or partner. 27% said parents or parent. Almost 12% said child or children. You can see 10% said friend, right? 4% said roommate. And then very small numbers for other types of groups. Just looking at by race, ethnicity, if we look at the all voters, you're all eligible voters who voted, right? And again, filled out their ballot with someone else, 58%. But for Black voters, that was a little bit lower. For spouse or partner, a little bit lower. Latino, a little bit lower. White, much higher at 64%. AAPI, about the same as the total group. And then for children, another big difference. And again, there's much here that we could be looking at, but I just want to point out for the total population, 11.7% said children. Again, those that filled out their ballot with someone else. But for children, much lower for Black voters, much higher or about the same if you compare it to the total population. For Latinos, whites, much higher for AAPI. Who returned your ballot or dropped it in the mail in the November 2022 general election? So now this is about not filling out, but this is about, right, who's returning it for you. So 85% said, I did. And another 8.3% said a member of my immediate family did. And by the way, on this previous chart, I just want to say, some of the differences, for instance, by age, young people age 18 to 24 were much more likely to say roommate, much more likely to say their parents, much less likely to say a spouse, which might make sense, right? Because if you were married, that sort of thing. Okay, so back to returning your ballot. 85% said I did, right? 8% said member of my immediate family. And then if we just look at the I did, let's just keep it simple for right now. Compared to everyone, Black voters a little bit lower at 75, or actually quite lower at 75%. That's 10 percentage points lower. Latino also lower, white higher, and AAPI about the same there. And then a member of my immediate family, much higher for Black voters, higher for Latino voters. Factors in the in-person voting process. And again, I know that many of you are going to want to look and stare and really think about some of these charts. My apologies. I'm just doing highlights, going through them quickly, and invite you to look at the report later. So factors. So why did you vote in person at a voting location in the November 22 general election? So the next few charts are all about the in-person voting process. We do, in the appendix of the report, also provide the same questions broken out for people who voted at a staffed voting location, and people who voted or dropped off their ballot at a staffed voting location, or people who dropped off their ballot at a drop box, because we wanted to know the differences, right, by method in terms of why people were using one method over another, either choosing to or needing to. So why did you vote in person? So just some things highlighted here. The most common response, again, this could be select all that apply, multiple responses. It was convenient, close to my home at 50.6%. Then 30% said it was convenient, close to my work or school. Convenient, close to where I had errands to run, 13%. To receive an I voted sticker, 16%. To be seen representing my community at 12%. Another 11% said I don't trust the mail to deliver my ballot. And of course, we realize if you're in a voter's choice Act county versus a traditional polling place county, there are different options that you have, right? In a polling place county, you are assigned a traditional, usually neighborhood or at least close proximity polling place. And there are differences when we break this out by the method, the model that is used in a county. So, but just focused here, same question, now looking at race ethnicity. Again, that first answer was convenient, close to my home, 50% right for everybody, pretty similar for Black voters, a little less for Latinos, whites a tiny bit higher, and higher for AAPI. Again, so much richness here, but we won't have a chance to do that. I do want to note that the percentages now are pretty small for I voted sticker. I mentioned it was 16% for the overall population. Years ago, when we'd ask a question somewhat similar to this, we got really, really high numbers for I voted sticker, but that was because you couldn't get, or at least for the overwhelming majority of counties in California, you couldn't get an I voted sticker unless you voted in person. And that now has changed, right? And people can get their I voted sticker in lots of ways, including often getting it through the mail. Okay, so why did you choose a specific in-person location? Again, really quickly here. Now, this is a specific location. 59% close to home, 14% close to work, assigned by my elections office, right? Convenient operating hours. And there are differences here also by race ethnicity. So we just look at close to home, 57 to 57 if we look at Latinos, whites 60%, AAPI 59%. So small changes here. But if you look at some of the other options, like assigned my location, and this, of course, is people's perception. So people could be wrong or right about whether they actually were assigned a location. Okay, moving on because of time. How did you learn about the specific in-person location where you voted? Here, again, on this question, very similar to the overall question the larger question that we asked earlier about information sources. Here on the specific location, people cited most commonly the voter guide, again, the county website, the vote by mail packet, again, those official sources. And yes, just as in that larger question about information sources, here again, we see differences by race ethnicity, also big differences by age and disability status. Again, I invite you to look at the report for that. How did you get to the in-person voting location where you voted in the November 22 general election? About 2/3 said they drove. Another 21% said they walked or biked. 6.9% said they got a ride or they used Uber or Lyft. Almost 6% said public transportation, and then paratransit at 0.5%. How did you get to in-person location? This is just broken out by race ethnicity. If we just look at the drove question, you can see there's differences here, right, by race ethnicity. So 63% for Black, 69% for Latino voters, white 64%. And of course, by age and definitely by disability status, we see big differences as well. Paratransit obviously being higher, as you might expect, right, for voters with disability, at least for some. Now, in that same election, how many minutes did you travel to the in-person voting location where you voted? The most common response is 5 to 10 minutes, but we do see 25% of voters in that election said more than, again, this is in-person voters, said more than 20 minutes. Fortunately, well, no, not fortunately, sorry. It said more than 20 minutes. Okay, and then here we're looking by race, ethnicity. Again, differences in the amount of time people said that they traveled to that in-person location. So next segment here, this is our last segment, voters' preferences and how and where to vote in the 2024 general election and beyond. So in the future, what features would you likely use if you vote at an in-person voting location? Now, we note in the report, and we've asked questions like this, again, in previous voter experience surveys, we know that what people are saying now, right, could very well differ, their preferences now versus actual behavior in the future. So keep that in mind. But right now, voting in person, 46%, dropping off my vote by mail ballot, 41%, language assistance, 7.4%. These are features. Again, accessible voting machine for voters with disabilities, 11.6%. Registering to vote, another almost 12%. Again, differences by race, ethnicity, by age, pretty noteworthy as well. Language assistance is another one that right here, voting in person. But overall, you'll see that the number one feature people want to use is just voting in person, right? But then additionally, people also also cited other features as well, or at least some did. Some just responded once. All right, so this is a very busy chart. I'm going to move on to the next slide. It's just a little easier, but thinking ahead to future elections, what could be your most preferred way to cast a ballot? So we'll move over to the one broken out by race and ethnicity because we have all voters there as well. So again, asking all eligible voters whether they voted in the last election or not. And you can see that voting at an in-person voting location on election day, almost 29% said that when they think about future elections, that would be the most preferred way to cast a ballot. Again, actual behavior can be different for lots of reasons, right? Versus preferences at this point. Mailing in a ballot that was sent to my home a month before election day was another 24%. We also see a 10% for voting early at an in-person voting location, sometime in the 3 days before election day. And then another 9.2% said dropping off my vote by mail ballot at an in-person voting location after having that ballot mailed to my home a month before election day. We also want to note here too that again, there are differences in people's awareness of the options that are available to them too. So not every California voter is fully aware of actually most California voters we know from our research are not fully aware of all of their options. For some, this is, as they read these options, they are less familiar with them. If you vote in person in future elections, when are you most likely to vote? You'll see here about 35% said election day. Again, this is specifically for in-person voters in the future. 21% said the week before election day, if that option was made available. But you see, we also see 15% for the weekend before, the day before, another 15%. So that's 30% saying the weekend or the day before election day, if you add those up. And also pretty significant differences when we talk about election day. Much lower for Black voters. Again, this is in person, right? And Latino voters, much higher for white voters at 40%. And differences, but we won't get into right now because of time, but differences, though, when we look at and break it out by the other options. And again, of course, by age, very much so here, and for voters with disabilities as well. So planning voter outreach for the 2024 general election. Just a few recommendations here. Very similar to what we covered last week. These are our overarching recommendations from the series of reports. Voter groups need targeted outreach that addresses the differential experiences of each group with regard to the voting and election process. And here we're talking about everything from how they're actually voting, the options that they're choosing, the information sources, the reasons for those differing experiences, And of course, when we talk about filling out a vote by mail ballot, there are different experiences there as well. When messaging to voters, we talked last week about the options that they have to cast when you're messaging about their options that they have to cast their ballot. Consider a community empowerment type language. Again, we talked about that last week. It's in our report that we released last week as well. Some voters need messaging targeted to assist them with gaining access to the voting process, right? Ensuring or reassuring around the voting process. Others have concerns about what happens to their ballot, more security related. Campaigns need varying messaging to address the concerns of eligible voters to be more effective, specifically across demographics of race, ethnicity, age, and disability status, and more, right? But we did not, and we're not able to cover beyond the groups that we were able to do for this survey. And eligible voters of different subgroups respond more positively to some messages over others. And of course, as we've now shown a number of times last week and this week, official voter materials are a trusted source of information. They matter. They are where most voters across groups are getting their information. So we recommend that they should be easy to use, written in plain language, available in different formats and languages. And then friends and family are key information source. They're also involved for many voters in their actual filling out of their ballot or in the delivery of their vote by mail ballot. And that's significant, right, as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. One question here, I think when they're anonymous, people can't see them on your end, so I'm going to read it out here. For support to complete ballot or completing a ballot with someone else, does this include support on who, what to vote for, or just how to vote? So we asked the question just as you see it, right? With whom do they fill out the ballot? Who helped deliver the ballot? We did not get into specifics in terms of those individuals helping them, guiding them, or influencing them, right, on how they actually filled out their ballot in terms of races or candidates. It's a great question. We have heard through other research that we've done with community organizations that sometimes there is a question, right? When individuals in the home are filling out their vote by mail ballot, if they're getting assistance, largely it's assumed that assistance is helpful, right? Could be, an abuela around a dining room table getting assistance, right, on language, for instance, right? Or parents helping their kids with information sources and those sorts of things. Lots of different examples that are all positive. But others also have wondered if for particular voters there might be more likelihood of having some influence that could potentially be negative or unwanted. We don't have research, right, that can address that, but I guess I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that the data that we have that says that people are receiving help, something I think seems like common sense, right? And we know, but we do see it's a pretty large segment of the voting population that say they're receiving help. It's up to groups to take that information in when they work with voters and use that in a way that they think makes sense for them, right? Let me see if there's any other questions. It's another comment, but not a question. Okay. Well, it's another question. Thank you. From Catherine Hazelton. Do your materials provide specific information or recommendations for how to conduct outreach to specific target populations, such as AAPI, adults, or young Latino voters? Thank you. Our work is research-based, right? So we provide the data largely to inform efforts that are on the ground. They're going to take those findings, right? And different groups are probably going to use them in different ways. We have some more digestible pieces, like with our most recent reports that we released. We also, along with the reports, provided a companion brief that was, I think, digestible and gave just the main findings of the research. And particularly around our messaging research, that does get very specific, and we've broken that out for people both in the report and in the kind of a tangible 2-page, 3-page brief that people can use, like when they're in meetings or in community, in in a way, hopefully, that is useful and informs their work. Do we get into a lot of specifics? We're very careful as a research, nonpartisan, academic-based research center to not extend past the data that we have. So if we haven't tested specifics, then we tend to be careful and leave it up to individual groups, right, to interpret the data in ways that make sense for them on the ground, also acknowledging the vast differences that we also know geographically across the state. Hopefully that answers your question, Catherine. Another anonymous question is, apologies if you mentioned this already, was this polling with voters who turned out or just registered voters? No, thanks for the question. So the entire nearly 12,000 survey sample was eligible voters in California, so adult citizens. And then, as you can see, right, some of the questions, right, are broken out and only asked of people who voted, right, how they voted, why they voted that way. Again, if they voted with somebody, right, with someone's assistance, that sort of thing. But the overall population and the majority of the questions were asked of the full eligible voter population. And the survey itself is representative of the eligible voter population in California. We think it's very important wherever possible to conduct surveys that are representative of the overall voter population. And so, as I mentioned really briefly in the slide on the methodology, it is representative by race and ethnicity in California, and sample size is very similar to the overall eligible youth voter population as well. Let me see if there's any other questions. Don't think you have any other questions. Okay, so I went through a lot very fast. Again, you're welcome to, and I invite you to look at all of the research. We're releasing a lot already, 2 major new reports, new research again at the end of this week, new research next week. We are outreaching to groups to hold individual conversations. Anyone can contact us and request a more in-depth conversation or run through of the data. We're very happy to do that. We answer any and all requests, no matter the individuals or entities that are asking that, because again, we are a nonpartisan academic institution about disseminating and educating around the democracy field. And let me just check one more question. I think that's it. All right. Thank you all very much.